This week on Diabetes Connections, screening has moved front and center in the conversation around type 1 diabetes, but we're still very much at the beginning of all this. So what do we really need to know? I'm talking with Dr. Shara Bialo. She's a pediatric endocrinologist who lives with type 1. She was diagnosed as a kid and she went to DKA. So now she's working with Sanofi to push for screening. We talk about wanting better guidelines, more mental health support, and how do we move this research into the general population where it can have the greatest impact? This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Hey everybody, welcome to another week of Diabetes Connections. You know we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. I'm your host, Stacey Sims. And as this episode goes live, I am at the Children with Diabetes Friends for Life conference happening in Orlando right now. So hopefully the air conditioning is working. I've got my water bottle and I'm staying in the shade. I'm staying in the conference center. And I got to be honest with you, you know how these places are. It's probably freezing. I'm probably wearing a sweater. But I hope you follow along on social. I'll be posting a lot. This is the largest family conference for diabetes in the United States, possibly in the world. And it's always just a really great time. It's all about community and seeing some familiar faces and meeting new people. And it just gets bigger and better every single year. I do have a Friends for Life Mom's Night Out pricing special. So if you're at the event, please come find me. I am at booth number T17. So there are a bunch of smaller tables that line the outside of the exhibitor space. If you know where the Omnipod gigantic booth is once you're there, just go right through that and keep Sanofi on your right, and you will see me and my table. And I have some in-person pricing specials for you. If you're not attending, just use the promo code FFL, and that will save you 15% off our fall events. The early bird special has ended for Minneapolis. That event takes place in September, coming up fast. And we will also be in Phoenix in October. Early bird special for that one ends the first weekend of August. And when I get back from Friends for Life, we will be all systems go, not just on those fall events, but some other announcements coming your way about other events we've been working on. And in addition, the 2026 Mom's Night Out cities, we're going to work on that. We'll have dates and venues for you soon. Summer used to feel slower for me. It is a very busy time right now, but I got to tell you, I wouldn't change it. All right, my guest this week is the Senior Medical Director of Sanofi T1D Immunology. Dr. Shara Bialo was diagnosed 32 years ago at the age of 9. As I said, she was in DKA at the time. She will tell the whole story. And I got to tell you, it is nice to have somebody living with type 1 who also has children who can be screened as part of this team at Sanofi. She gets it. She knows what we're all thinking. She had the same fear and guilt and procrastination about her own kids. And I think she adds an awful lot to the conversation here. I should also add that I am doing another interview, not so much about screening with Sanofi, but about the next step, about what do you do about it, about Tzield and treatment and what's next. So that episode will be up in the next couple of weeks. And I even got Dr. Bialo to answer some questions about teenagers and young adults with type 1, something she is very passionate about. Our conversation right after this. Did you know all the sounds used to make that song come from a site change with the Omnipod 5 automated insulin delivery system? Pretty cool, huh? With Omnipod 5, pump site changes are simple. The pod lasts up to 3 days, 72 hours, and to change it, you just fill up the pod with insulin, place it on your body, tap a few buttons in the Omnipod 5 app, and you're ready to go. There's no tubing to prime like with traditional insulin pumps, and it's virtually pain-free. So you never have to see or handle the insertion needle. Want to try Omnipod 5 for yourself? Request a free Omnipod 5 starter kit today by visiting omnipod.com/diabetesconnections. Terms and conditions apply. Eligibility may vary.
Did you hear the pod drop?
Dr. Shara Bialo, welcome to Diabetes Connections. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I appreciate it. How are you doing?
Of course. Well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
Before we jump in, tell me a little bit about yourself. You live with type 1. You still see some patients, but you're working with Sanofi now. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, of course. So my personal type 1 journey started when I had just turned 9 years old. I was a healthy kid, typical kid life up until then, started to demonstrate the typical symptoms that we all know now, unfortunately, the drinking, the peeing, bedwetting. And my parents had a suspicion that something was very off. And so they took me to the pediatrician. They didn't know what was wrong. We didn't have any family history of type 1, but they knew that something was not right. And so they took me to my pediatrician who ordered some outpatient labs, sent us home to await result. I took a nap. I was exhausted. And then I didn't wake up from that
Oh,
nap.
wow.
It's awful. My father had to carry me into the emergency room where luckily our pediatric endocrinologist met us there, having known sort of the backstory. And they were able to piece things together pretty quickly. But I spent almost a week in the hospital. I was in the ICU with DKA. I was in a coma due to undiagnosed diabetic ketoacidosis. And it was just sort of a terrible traumatic entry to a chronic illness for my parents. I was an only child, like no exposure to illness at all. It was not ideal. It sort of kicked off a rough relationship with type 1. And this was granted 32 years ago. So I consider myself a diabetes dinosaur by many standards. I'm sure there are other dinosaurs listening with us now.
This was the early 90s, though. So,
Yeah, I was
yeah,
93,
yeah.
and so I, was started on NPH and regular and, started on, like, bovine and porcine insulin, so pig and cow insulins, and it was the wild, wild west pretty much, like, my meter was so clunky, I didn't and expensive, I didn't take it to school, it was just, didn't even know who my school nurse was really, like, it's just totally different experience, which is hard to imagine now. I have these conversations with my patients and their families and, I guess fast forward, I became a pediatric endocrinologist. Spoiler alert there. But I struggled with my type 1 diagnosis throughout most of my adolescence and really into early adulthood. With denial and just not wanting to deal with it. I was probably my doctor's worst patient, but always into academics and the sciences. So I found my way to medicine and couldn't help but be taken by endocrinology and pediatrics in particular. And once I grew up a little bit, matured, my frontal cortex myelinated a little bit. I was able to see that it helps. I was able to see that I could possibly see a silver lining in all of it and help, the teens and adolescents that were really struggling with the journey the way I once had. It was definitely a long way out of the darkness for me. So became a pediatric endocrinologist, practiced full time, and then about 3 years ago had the opportunity to join a small biotech called Prevention Bio, who is working on advancements in intervention in early type 1 diabetes. So a lot of people aren't always aware that there are three distinct stages to the way that type 1 diabetes rolls out, with the third stage being the one we're all familiar with, which is when you actually have symptoms of high blood sugar. The first two are really silent and sort of under the radar as far as that autoimmune process that's taking place under the surface. So joined Prevention Bio as a medical director, helping to oversee a team of medical science liaisons who go out and help educate physicians and other clinical healthcare workers about early T1D screening and intervention. And we were acquired by Sanofi. And I was lucky enough to stay on with the Sanofi team and continue this good work that we're doing to try to spread the word about the option to catch this before someone could experience the foray into type 1 that I had.
Yeah. And I want to come back and ask you a little bit more about your experience and about your work with teens. But let's talk about screening because it's really been fascinating to watch this. And certainly, my son was diagnosed more than 18 years ago at a time when screening didn't really come up. And certainly once it did, in the form, in our experience of TrialNet, where you'd go at diabetes camp and, hey, do you want to give a sample of your blood? And we can tell you some things. It didn't seem to mean that anything would happen to the person who was being tested, right? It was all about, let's do some research, let's help other people. That's wonderful. And then fast forward to this time now where I've met people whose families have been impacted. The one child may have type 1, another child has been diagnosed with one of the early stages, but has taken Tzield and is under treatment and does not have any signs or symptoms. It's really very different. But people like me and families like mine, that have been around for a long time, we have a lot of questions. So let me start with, what do you tell families about screening? I know that ultimately the goal probably is to reach people who aren't familiar at all with type 1 diabetes, right? Because we need to get the
Yeah.
general population. But starting with people who are a little bit familiar about it, how do you talk to them about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're right. I think that When we look at how many people are diagnosed with type 1 each year, 90% of them have no connection, no family connection to type 1, right? No family history. That's tough, right? Because that leaves 10% of those diagnosed every year, the roughly 64,000 that are diagnosed every year who do have a family connection. But that's, I think, the lowest hanging fruit. That's kind of where we need to start. They're the ones that are most visible to us in a clinic setting. And so I think you start there and you talk about, even though it's a small portion of the people who are diagnosed every year, that population, those who have either a first or second degree relative, are upwards of 15 times increased risk of developing type 1 compared to someone with no family history. So you have to really, I think, start there, sort of put it into context as to why that conversation is important for that family who already knows it. Some know it better than others. Maybe it's a cousin or an aunt or uncle who's impacted and they don't know it on sort of an intimate, like minute to minute basis,
Right.
but it still counts. And I think it's somewhere. Same thing. The next layer to that, I think, would be people with autoimmune disease in general, autoimmune thyroid disease, celiac disease, which tend to kind of cluster in that type 1 family. And then we'll ultimately have to make our way to general population screening. But it's tough when people don't know what it is they're trying to look for, what it means for them. And when the guidelines haven't quite caught up, the medical guidelines.
Right.
Have the American Diabetes Association, which for endocrinologists like me is the Bible, basically, of how we practice clinical medicine. And the ADA recommends screening for family members very pointedly. But we need those guidelines to kind of filter out into the American Academy of Pediatrics and the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force and like those other sort of broader population services that are helping us determine what's best for preventative care. So we're somewhere in the middle right now, but it's making big progress.
Yeah. I look at my own family as the example of what I guess is pretty typical. Well, not typical in that my son was diagnosed at 23 months, but typical in that my daughter, who's 3 years older, has never been screened. And we didn't have her screened when she was a kid because, like, oh my gosh, it's another blood draw. That's not fun. There's already enough stuff going on with these kids. And then as she got older, I was like, well, it kind of has to be her decision. And also, do we, and I'll put myself forward as somebody who is, pretty well educated about this stuff, but not really sure if I have the story straight in that, well, in kids, sometimes the markers have to be retested. Sometimes things can change. My daughter is 23 now, and I haven't had this conversation with her again about getting screened.
Mhm.
What's your reaction to what I just said?
Not surprised. I mean, it would be the pot calling the kettle black if I had anything to say about it because look, here I am, type 1 for 32 years, pediatric endocrinologist, work in T1D immunology on a daily basis. I have two children, 5 and 8, and I did not get them screened until last year for the first time. But there's a lot of different reasons for that. And I think the big question here is, what is the root of the inaction or the hesitation? And for different people, it's a different answer.
Yeah.
No, for me, it was 100% fear. I just felt in my gut that if I tested, it was going to be positive and I was going to feel this guilt that it was my fault because I'm the one with type 1, even though we know that's completely nonsensical because no one asked for this or is responsible for this. I mean, we can be scientists and still be irrational. Right? So
Yeah.
we're
I
human
appreciate your
first.
honesty.
Yeah, we're human
Absolutely.
first.
Yeah.
And so I think for a lot of people, it's fear, avoidance, denial, easier to just kind of stick your head in the sand than to kind of face it. For others, it's a slight misunderstanding of the reality of how type 1 rolls out in families. I think that when you know type 1 well, you're like, well, why would I need to screen? Like, I'll catch the drinking and the peeing. Like, there's no way that that would get past me. No way on this good earth would my child or my sister or my father ever go through DKA because I would catch it early. And that's
Right.
actually not true for a
Right.
good chunk of people. We have, people with new onset diabetes who have family history, like 20 to 30% of them still end up in DKA. And so sometimes we think that we're savvier than we really are, unfortunately. And that just goes to show how finicky and difficult to pin down type 1 can be, how much it can mimic, a flu, or you can convince yourself you're drinking a lot because it's hot outside, all sorts of things. So I think that one, we have to take a little piece of humble pie and recognize that we can't always recognize everything. And two, face our fears a little bit. I think that for me, the fear thing, it's going to sound so cheesy, but I, grew up watching Mr. Rogers and like he was originally from Orlando where I grew up and it was a whole thing. And he has this quote basically and it really spoke to me. It says that anything that is mentionable can be manageable in so many, I'm paraphrasing. But basically, like, if we can talk about it, we can manage it. We need to talk about our feelings. It needs to start to become less overwhelming. And I think about that a lot because that's ultimately what did it for me. It was being able to talk to my husband about it, who's, my best friend, and obviously the father of my children. And it was really him who said, Shara, like, it's our job as parents to do everything in our power to protect our kids, to give them every advantage. And he's like, in my mind, screening for autoantibodies is an advantage that we'd be giving them should, heaven forbid, they come out positive. It would give us time to prepare, give us time to get educated, to avoid, a possible hospitalization, make the whole thing a little bit softer. And he's like, I don't really see a downside to this. And then I was like, oh man, no, I have to do it.
Yeah.
And I got to do it. Shaking my
What?
fist at my husband who's right. And then honestly, Stacey, when I did it, and knock on wood, it was negative, I completely underestimated the relief. I actually didn't even allow myself to consider possibility of a negative and how much relief I would feel in that. But you're right. It's not a test that's a one and done for people, right? There is the need to rescreen. People can, what we call seroconvert, go from no autoantibodies to having 2 or more positive autoantibodies, which is the diagnosis, virtually at any point. But they say if you screen at ages roughly 2, 4 to 6, 9 to 10, say you do all those 3 screenings and you're negative, let me flip it. If you test at those ages, you can catch about 80% of type 1 cases. There's a lot we don't know still about adult cases of type 1 and when they may pop up with autoantibodies, but a lot of experts think that it actually happens quite early. The vast majority of people will pop up with autoantibodies between 9 months and 2 years of age.
Wow.
But they're funny. It's not like a genetic test where it's always, it's going to be a yes or a no question. So repeated measurements are sometimes necessary to make sure that you're getting the most accurate picture.
And I think the idea, and I may be interpreting this wrong, but kind of the idea that we're early in all of this. Like, as you said, it's not like a genetic test where it's black and white. There it is. There's the answer. We're early in this. Things like that can make people say, well, I'm not going to do it, right? I'm not ready.
Feels
It's not
too
conclusive.
new.
It's too
Yeah.
new.
So the very first autoantibody test was developed in the early 70s, and it's something that we still use today. It's called ICA, but then better, more accurate autoantibody tests came after it. So we had the possibility of measuring 5 different ones. The American Diabetes Association recommends 4 of the 5, the 4 newer ones, actually, as being the most reliable. And it takes 2 or more of them being positive to make the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. And I think this is also a mental shift that needs to happen. That has been in the research sphere for many, many years. It came into the clinical sphere in 2015, so already 10 years already. Clinicians, whether or not they kept up with the literature is another thing. I don't think that we socialized this whole idea as well as we could have. We've known about this for a very, very long time, though. Thankfully, thanks to, TrialNet and other very large-scale studies, we sort of understand the way that diabetes rolls out. But I think that's the divide between what have we been doing in clinical practice versus what has been happening in the research setting, and they're not always aligned, right? It takes a long time for clinical practice to catch up with what the research scientists have known for a much longer time. And once we start doing more of it, I think people will be more confident, in that process. But it kind of takes buy-in on all fronts.
I don't want to get too far ahead. Going back to talking about screening your kids, I know you were relieved when it did come back. What were they like during it? Did they know? Like, I'm just curious. What did you tell them? What was the experience like?
They were 4 and 6.5 at the time. And my kids don't ask too many questions.
What's
They
that
don't ask
like?
too many
Oh
questions.
my
They're
God.
very surface. My son has more, my oldest son, I have a currently 8-year-old son and 5.5-year-old daughter. My son is much more inquisitive. So I kept things very broad. They're like, why do we have to? They were very upset over having to do a blood draw. Now, granted, you can get screened in many different ways through many different outlets. You can go through research studies like TrialNet and Ask. You can do that from a phlebotomist, like going to a lab and having it drawn from the arm. You can get a home kit where you prick the finger and milk it into a tube for collection. You can do commercial labs like LabCorp and Quest. There's now a sort of telemedicine, a telehealth platform option called Screening Central that's screenfortype1.com, which you can sort of talk to people virtually and get sent out orders or a kit. So I knew that my children would not tolerate any sort of finger milking from me, and I wasn't about to be the bad guy. So I was like, we're just going to go to a commercial lab. I actually, because I work in an endocrine office, had my colleagues order it for me. I cheated a little bit. Perks of the job, I guess. And took them and basically was like, we need to do a test to make sure that your insides look as healthy as your outsides. And if you're good, then we can go, pick out a small toy afterwards at Target. Like it's just
Oh,
not
yeah. We've
about
all
bribing.
been there.
Not about bribing in any situation.
Incentives, we call those.
Exactly,
Incentives.
exactly. And my son had a few questions, but really, they know that I have something called type 1 diabetes. They know that they don't get the fruit snacks that I carry around in my purse. Like they're most disgruntled about that. And they know that, if my blood sugar goes high or low, it can affect how I'm feeling. But beyond that, we haven't really delved too deep because they're just so young to
Yeah.
understand it. So I did tell them that it was related to me and my diabetes, and I wanted to see if who knows how much they really comprehended that. I think ultimately they were more focused on the bribe, and so they both earned it. But it was an interesting process. The blood draw was like a non, I had worked it up. We always work it up in our heads a little bit more. Kids are pretty tough. They really had no issue with that. And luckily the phlebotomist, the tech was familiar with the test and knew how to send it off. And that's not everywhere is, unfortunately, because it's still a process that's starting to take off. The results came back within 2 weeks, but they came back one at a time. So I had ordered 4 antibodies
Oh,
on each kit, and they just
wow.
rolled in one at a time. Things are improving now, and you have the possibility of ordering panels and, grouping the testing together. But that was a little anxiety provoking, to see one at a time. And I'd sort of like heart rate would quicken every time one would pop into my portal, inbox on my phone app. But ultimately, knowing what I know now of the results, and thank goodness they're negative and I will get them rescreened again soon, it was worth it. It was worth all the initial stress just to know. And I would hope that had the outcome been the opposite, and had I found out that they were positive, that I would still feel that gratitude, knowing that we can take steps now to prepare for the inevitable. And when I say inevitable, I really mean inevitable. If you have 2 or more autoantibodies, it's not if you're going to develop clinical type 1, it's when. And that part's hard too, because you can't predict with certainty when, it will roll out. There's a lot of study being done in this area related to CGM metrics and sort of time above range. And there's a lot of interest here to kind of zone in on who's most at risk of progressing faster than others, so you can time out how you want to intervene. So that part is a little tough. But I just think that testing and knowing was one of the most empowering things I had done health-wise in a long time.
Yeah. It's amazing because I remember when my son was diagnosed, his diagnosis story was a little unusual in that he had classic signs. I called the pediatrician and she said, well, he's too young, but bring him in so we can rule it out. And his fasting blood glucose was 80, but his A1C was 11.5. So if we didn't have a doctor who knew
Yeah.
enough to push and take that A1C, it probably would have gone a lot longer. And he wasn't in DKA. He barely had large ketones. We were super lucky. But it was a little scary because it took a few days to get that A1C test back. And they were like,
Yeah.
we don't know what it is. He's normal. Like, he doesn't have diabetes. What else could it be? So it's almost a relief to find out that that's what he had, because my brain had gone to some crazy places. But I remember talking at the time, like, why don't they just screen these kids, like every kid, for type 1 diabetes at the pediatrician? Pee in a cup, look for the sugar in the
Yeah.
urine,
Yeah.
do an A1C test when they're doing other blood work or whatever. And, being told, well, there's so many things we could screen for. This doesn't make any sense financially. It doesn't make any sense for the number of kids. I mean, what we're talking about now is something different from that, but the thinking behind it is kind of the same.
Yeah.
I mean, do you encounter a lot of people who kind of say that same thing that I just did, where it's like, well, why don't we just check their blood sugar? Or why don't we just look for sugar in the urine? I know it's
Yeah.
the different stage, right?
Exactly. So it's so interesting. There are huge numbers of people, especially those personally impacted by type 1, who advocate for checking more routinely. And it would be great. But just like you said, it's tricky, right? If you had just gone with a fasting blood sugar, you would have missed it. There are different parameters. There's different parameters for how you diagnose clinical type 1. One of them is fasting. One of them is A1C. One of them is postprandial, right? Like 2 hours after or through an oral
Right.
glucose
Yeah.
tolerance test. And they have different sensitivities for sort of where you are in the disease process. One of the first to convert like into abnormal levels is, how your body manages carbs, which is why an oral glucose tolerance test tends to be the gold standard for like research studies and to see exactly where you stand. But it's also the biggest pain to order in an outpatient, like non-research setting. A1C is tricky too, because if you look at some of the intervention studies that have taken place in early T1D, a lot of the patients who were in them had totally normal A1Cs, but it was, again, their post-meal blood sugars that were off because A1C is a 3-month average and it's going to take into account maybe like, the 8 hours a night you were totally in range, so on and so forth. So testing blood sugar, while it would help in many situations, would not necessarily help us in all situations because you could be catching it at a time where it's going to be in totally normal range and you just wouldn't know. Autoantibody screening offers more benefits. The more we learn about it, the more I think it's truly the advantageous option because it's not going to depend on what you ate that day, what the timing is per se, although there's research going on to see if morning versus afternoon levels have any changes. But basically, it can be positive for years and years before you develop clinical stage 1. So I was alluding to earlier in our conversation that you can convert to having positive autoantibodies between 9 months and 2 years. The majority of people do. But the average age of getting diagnosed with clinical type 1 isn't until, between 10 and 14 years. So there's this huge latency period where we could be screening and catching all of these kids and avoiding decay. And we have study after study after study here in the States, across the world, in patients who have family members with type 1 and those who have no family history and they're just community screens, who show us that if we can catch those autoantibodies, we absolutely decimate the number of people who show up in diabetic ketoacidosis. We can virtually eliminate it with screening and monitoring, right? The key is monitoring, though. Like you can't just screen and let people go on their merry way. You have to educate
Yeah.
them
Yeah.
on what to do. But like it's honestly very avoidable. So that should hopefully motivate people enough. But I think that the way that our healthcare system works, especially in this country, it's very fragmented. People aren't as jazzed about preventative care as they could be. And so we've got, a lot of hurdles to kind of bust through. But we're making good headway. I think that the awareness is really picking up. And these are the great questions, right? Why not? Why blood sugar and not autoantibody screening? I think there are a lot of endocrinologists who would say do both. Do both. If you're going to draw blood, at least get a measure of glucose while you're at it. But cost always comes into account.
You mentioned right at the beginning that you're really passionate about talking to teenagers and young adults. My son is 20. We're out of the teenage years, just barely. Very tough for a lot of people with their kids with type 1 that move from dependence on parents to independence. I mean, we could probably talk for 4 hours. We probably talk for 4 days about it. But any top tips for parents, especially, like what really helps?
I could talk about this for days.
I'll have
And
you
one of
back
these
on.
days,
We'll
I
do a
should
whole
probably
show.
consider like writing a book on it. I have just so much to talk about. I think that, the idea of independence is a tricky one. I think not even taking into account adulthood, just even in teenage years, there's this want for kids and teens to take it all on their own and sort of grow up and be independent. But it's so much. It's so taxing. Type 1, it's just an hourly, like minute to minute management burden that I think it should be shared in the family as long as possible. As long as caretakers are willing to share in that burden, I think the better off the child or adolescent with diabetes will be in the end. They mature over time, but oftentimes people don't have the wherewithal to recognize that they're burnout, to ask for help, and instead they just kind of stop doing what they should be doing, and not all the dots are connected in that way. I think independence in baby steps is important. And I think as hard as it, and I'm a mom now, so like I just get that when my patients tell me that their parents nag them, I hear your parent loves you. Like nagging is love. And if your parents are nagging you, that I have more to worry about in that situation. But I think trying to keep it as light and airy and positive as possible, which is really hard when you're dealing with a chronic illness that you are worried about is causing micro damage to your child. It's hard not to get sort of in a tizzy about that when you're sharing, CGM readings on phones and you're seeing someone's very high. It's hard not to freak out. I always tell them, try not to freak out, try to be clinical about it, try not to assign emotion to it, which again is another very heavy lift in type 1. We assign emotion to everything. All the numbers are grades in our minds. Like it's an awful association. It's my pump going off. Do you hear?
Go
I need to
ahead,
charge
take your
it.
time.
It's all good. It's very, very classic, right? Type 1 just interrupts everything. But I think that trying to remain as non-judgmental and as helpful as possible is always going to be the way. Open lines of communication. You always want the child to be able to come to you in times of need and confide and feel supported. And then ultimately, as we become true adults and truly responsible, and again, frontal cortex is all myelinated and nice and pretty and mature, some things
I can't
can
wait.
improve. Although it's easy to say, like, here I am as a fully fledged adult with longstanding type 1 as the professional, and I'm still going to have bad days. And I'm still going to have moments in my workday where I somehow let my pump charge go all the way down. It's going to happen. And I think we just need to give ourselves a little grace.
Yeah. And to that end, you were diagnosed in 1993. It's a long time. I imagine the control wasn't that great, but you're
Mhm.
doing okay. You have two happy, healthy kids. It may sound silly to you, but knowing that, and you talk about the micro damage that, people are fear about, people are afraid to let their kids go over 150.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know. I'm not going to ask you to editorialize on that. I do enough of that myself. But you are an example of somebody who was in the bad old days before you had a meter that you took to school, you
Yeah.
said, and you're okay.
Yep. I don't have three heads. It's still standing. I will say I'm very grateful for the progress, though.
Oh, no doubt.
I would never go back to the dark ages. Yeah, it's been over 3 decades of this. I do have eye complications. I have had to have laser for some retinopathy that they had to do before I was allowed to proceed with family planning, so that was
Mm.
not a fun time, but again, manageable. Like I said, I was out of control. I mean, even given the resources in the early days, what didn't help was my complete emotional inability to sort of manage the disease. That, if I could go back in time, I would have integrated some psychology support a lot earlier than I did. I was very resistant to that idea. It also wasn't that common growing
No, of
up
course
to get
not.
referred to psychology. So I think it should be mandatory in type 1. And it's really interesting the idea of psychosocial support with this chronic disease. It's so necessary. And there's as we start to identify more and more people in stage 1 and stage 2, we're going to have an even greater need for that because it's not sort of the daily burden of checking blood sugars and taking insulin in whatever form it comes in, but just sort of the mental load of knowing that, you're now in this club that no one wanted to be a part of. And how do we support that? Because it's wholly different from how we support people who are fully in the game. So I think the whole field is going to have to transform in many ways. Can I go throw this in the other room so it
Of
doesn't
course. We're almost done, but do whatever you need to do.
I just don't want it to keep
You
how
want
it
to
goes.
plug it
I don't
in?
what is your son on tech?
Oh, yeah. And he never lets his pump run down.
I
I
know,
can't
I know.
believe you.
Diabetes never plays nice.
Never stops.
Never plays nice.
To your point there, and I will wrap this up, I promise. I mentioned toward the beginning of this, the family that I spoke to that was one of the first of the area to have their child screened and then use Tzield, and the child is still on that. But we've got a daughter in that family who has type 1 and a son now who is preventing it or putting it off for a while, is undergoing the treatment. And I asked the family about mental health and how does that, what kind of conversations are they having? Because they were very open about how their daughter was really excited to kind of help their son, but also it's kind of crappy that she didn't have the opportunity to do this. And here's the son who feels guilty, right? So they are
Yeah,
addressing it head on and doing an amazing job. But I worry about that a lot because we all know how hard it is to get mental health help.
yep.
But you're talking about really trying to make this part of it going forward, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, it'd be really nice. I think that the mental health aspect is going to creep in no matter what. So you
Mm,
bring up an important point about that family. Type 1 is definitely a family diagnosis. It's going to have complicated dynamics no matter what. But there's really a mental burden that many experience on the flip side. Like, say they had not screened their
right.
son, right? Had not found it. And how would that roll out, right? The flip side is not always the better option. Last year, Sanofi actually commissioned some research called Cost of Not Knowing, and it was from Beyond Type 1, and it basically measured the impact of a Type 1 diagnosis, and they polled 1,000 adults with Type 1 and 1,000 caregivers, and it was really looking at what was the impact on emotional and social and financial health with the goal to understand if early detection could have helped mitigate any of those impacts. And one of the parts that really stood out to me was this whole concept of regret, right? Both adults with type 1 and caregivers really regretted not learning sooner when they find out after the fact that they could have known a little bit sooner. Almost 2/3 of adults said they regretted not getting screened after the fact, and 93% of caregivers said they wish they had learned about their loved one's risk of developing type 1 before they ever had their clinical diagnosis. And I think that it's important to listen to these voices that have been through it, right?
Yeah.
Because it's easy to take one slice of it without sort of seeing the full picture. But no matter how you cut it, it's hard. I mean,
Yeah.
type 1 is hard, which is why we need continued improvement in all aspects of it.
We did a whole episode on that survey, and I'll link that up in the show notes for this. It was really interesting to go through. And then before I let you go, recently Chrissy Teigen came out and talked about her son's diagnosis and her thoughts about screening and urging people to think about it. Do you get to work with those celebrities? Did you get to meet Chrissy?
I haven't met Chrissy yet, but
Okay.
it's really exciting that she's joined the Screen for Type 1 movement. Her story is really impactful. I think that the reason it is because it just mirrors so many families' experiences who've gone through the same, and just sort of really highlights how everything can change overnight. So it's really wonderful to have her on board. We've had a lot of great spokespeople with Sanofi, and I always say the more voices, the better. We're a tiny community, but mighty. And when we get anyone who's willing to get out there on any platform and speak for advancement and improvement, it's a win.
No doubt. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I hope we talk again soon. I would love to have you back on to talk more about teens. That would be amazing. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Stacey. It's a pleasure. Thanks for doing what you do to advocate for the community.
More information from Sanofi about screening, about Dr. Bialo, just go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the show notes for this episode. I will also put in the promo codes for Mom's Night Out and more information there. Remember, you can use promo code FFL to save 15% off Minneapolis or Phoenix. And I'm going to keep that promo code up a little longer than the Friends for Life conference. It will be valid until Tuesday, July 15th. So please don't wait. The earlier we have these registrations, the better these events are, I promise, because the more people we have at these events, the more we can do. And Minneapolis, you are showing up. This is going to be great. And Phoenix, you are catching up. I cannot wait for these fall events. It's going to be great. Okay, please come say hi if you're at the Friends for Life conference. I've got some surprises at my booth. I'm thrilled about the superhero theme. It's going to be so much fun to see what everybody does. People are so creative, and it's great to see some familiar faces and meet so many new people. Thanks to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions, and thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.